It was supposed to be a routine patrol, the kind that Sergeant Miller had done hundreds of times before, the kind that felt almost mechanical. Drive out to the training site on the outskirts of town, run a quick security check, and return before sunset. The day was bright, the air crisp, but there was a strange stillness in the air that morning, the kind of stillness that makes you pay closer attention without knowing why. He parked the truck at the edge of an old service road that hadn't been used in years, the pavement cracked and overgrown with weeds, and stepped out. Stretching his shoulders as he adjusted his uniform, Miller could only watch through fading eyes as the dog disappeared into the trees. His voice was barely audible, but the dog understood. It looked at him for just a moment longer, its gaze lingering with a loyalty that cut through the haze of pain, then turned and sprinted down the path with a speed Miller had never seen before. There was a scuffle, grunts, snarls, a shout, and then silence. When it reached the vehicle, it didn't wait, it kept going, out toward the edge of the woods where a passing car was heading down the road. The driver, startled by the sight of a police canine alone, slammed on the brakes. If the dog hadn't acted so quickly, if it hadn't found help when it did, the sergeant would have bled out alone in the woods. The dog barked frantically, darting in front of the car, circling it, then running a few feet ahead toward the woods before turning back, barking louder, desperate to make the person understand. The shooter had been waiting in that forest deliberately, hoping to ambush an officer. It wasn't random. It was planned. And the only reason the attacker didn't finish what they started was because the dog had chased them off, risking its own life to protect him. And most of all, how did the dog seem to know exactly what to do? As if it had planned every step ahead, confused but sensing something urgent. The driver followed the dog. Whenever nurses checked on him, the dog was there, resting its head gently on the side of his bed, eyes soft but watchful. Visitors would often pause at the door, moved by the quiet loyalty of the animal that had saved his life. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the dog returned, panting, a streak of dirt and sweat across its fur, eyes blazing with determination. It came back to Miller, nudged his chest gently, and barked once, sharply, as if to say, "Stay with me." At his side, the dog trotted out of the vehicle, alert but calm, those sharp eyes scanning everything with silent precision. Together, they made a perfect team. Years of trust and training had formed an unspoken language between them. One glance, one gesture, and they understood each other. His breaths were shallow, his vision fading in and out. He thought about his family, about how he might not make it out this time. He thought about the dog, about how much trust he had put into that animal, and somehow, he believed it would come back for him. Minutes later, just as darkness threatened to take him completely, he heard voices. Distant at first, then closer. Someone was calling his name. But something felt different that day. Miller couldn't quite name it, but deep down, he knew the forest they were about to enter carried a weight he hadn't felt before. The dog stayed by Miller's side the entire time, licking his face gently, whining softly, its eyes never leaving him. Even when the paramedics arrived and loaded him onto the stretcher, the dog refused to leave, following every step until they reached the ambulance. They began their inspection slowly, the dog's ears twitching as it sniffed the air. Pausing every so often to take in a faint sound or scent, Miller checked his radio signal, weak but functional, and kept moving forward. The trail narrowed into a winding path that led toward a forgotten maintenance cabin, one he'd only visited a handful of times. As they got closer, the dog suddenly stiffened, its body lowered, muscles tightening as a soft growl rumbled in its chest. Miller froze instantly. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. Scanning the area, he saw nothing unusual, just the empty trees, the long shadows stretching across the ground, but the dog's reaction meant something was wrong. Before Miller could react, there was a sudden, sharp sound, a crack, followed by a deafening blast that echoed through the trees. Pain exploded through his side. His knees buckled. He fell hard into the dirt, gasping as his vision blurred. The radio slipped from his hand and skittered out of reach. The dog barked furiously, spinning toward the source of the gunshot. Another shot rang out, ricocheting off a tree nearby. Miller struggled to crawl behind a fallen log, his breathing shallow. The warm, sticky feel of blood soaking through his uniform. The world spun around him. He couldn't see where the attacker was. But the dog didn't hesitate. With a sharp, protective bark, it lunged toward the direction of the shot. Miller tried to move, but the pain in his side was unbearable. He whispered weakly, "Go. Get help." The dog didn't stop. It ran back toward the truck, toward the main road, weaving through the trees like it knew exactly what it had to do. Back in the woods, Miller fought to stay conscious. The dog had led help straight to him. The driver and two other bystanders rushed to his side, one calling emergency services while the other pressed a jacket to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Miller was rushed to the hospital. The surgery took hours. The doctors said he was lucky. Very lucky. But that wasn't the end. Because as Miller recovered in the hospital, more pieces of the story came to light. Over the next few days, the bond between the sergeant and the dog deepened beyond what anyone could explain. But the story didn't stop there, because while the sergeant was healing physically, there were still unanswered questions. Why was he targeted? Who was behind the ambush? The miracle wasn't just that the dog found help. It was that in those critical moments, it seemed to understand more than anyone could imagine. And in the days to come, the dog would prove that this was only the beginning of what it was willing to do for its partner. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh linens, but even in the sterile white walls, there was a sense of quiet warmth because the dog never left the sergeant's side. For days, as Sergeant Miller lay recovering from the surgery that saved his life, the dog would sit beside the bed, its head gently resting on the edge of the mattress, eyes watchful and soft but filled with something deeper, something that spoke of an unbreakable bond. The dog walked beside him carefully, never pulling, never straying more than a few inches away, always watching. Neighbors would stop and stare, some even tearing up as they saw the way the dog slowed its steps to match Miller's limping gait, pausing patiently whenever he had to catch his breath. At night, when the sergeant would sit by the window with a cup of tea, lost in thought, the dog would quietly lie at his feet. And sometimes, in the stillness of those nights, he would speak softly to the dog about his fears, about the unanswered questions, about how he wasn't sure why he had been targeted. The dog would tilt its head slightly, listening, as if it understood every word. Nurses came and went, surprised each time at how calm yet protective the dog was. A tip had come in about a suspicious figure lurking near the same forest trail. Miller couldn't see clearly, but it was definitely a person, and they weren't supposed to be there. He felt his breath catch. Could it be the same person who shot him? Before he could even process it, the dog took off, not in an aggressive charge but in a silent, controlled movement. The man stumbled back, tripping over a log, his hands flying up defensively. Miller stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. It stayed locked on him, eyes sharp, body tense, ready to act if he made the wrong move. And in that tense standoff, Miller realized the truth: the attack in the forest hadn't been random. It was personal. It's over. This wasn't just a partner. It wasn't just a trained canine. This was a life-saving bond, one that went beyond instinct, beyond duty. It was that the dog never stopped saving him, even when no one else could. It disappeared behind the cabin, circling, clever and quiet. The figures suddenly froze, sensing something was wrong. They turned, and for the briefest second, Miller caught sight of their face. It was someone he recognized. As they led him away, Miller knelt beside the dog, his hand trembling as it rested on its fur. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew he'd come back." Patrol officers had gone to investigate but found nothing except for the dog. It moved with deliberate precision, sniffing the ground, tracing a scent Miller couldn't detect. weaving between the trees with a focus that seemed almost impossible. Minutes stretched on as they delved deeper into the woods, the air growing cooler, the shadows longer. Then the dog froze. Its ears twitched. Its body lowered slightly, muscles tight. Miller followed its gaze. The dog, who had been resting quietly at Miller's home, suddenly perked up, standing at the door and barking once, sharply, as if it knew. Miller felt a strange chill. It wasn't like any normal bark. It was purposeful. Intentional. Without hesitation, the dog trotted to the door, looking back at him, urging him to follow. Whenever someone entered the room, the dog would lift its head slightly, observing every movement, making sure no harm came near its partner. He grabbed his jacket, radioed in a quick message to dispatch, and followed the dog. They walked slowly at first, then faster as the dog's pace quickened, leading him through familiar streets, past the edge of town, and toward the very same woods where everything had started. By the time they reached the cracked service road, Miller's heart was pounding not from exertion but from the heavy weight of memory, and whenever Miller stirred, his eyes flickering open in the haze of painkillers and exhaustion, the first thing he would see was the dog, silently keeping vigil. A living reminder that he wasn't alone. Slowly, the color returned to his face. The doctors said his recovery was remarkable, almost too fast considering how close he had been to death. They called it resilience. He called it the dog's miracle. But while Miller's body was healing, his mind was restless. He kept replaying the moment in the woods. The gunshot echoing through the silence, the searing pain. And then the memory of the dog vanishing into the trees only to return with help. There was something about that day that didn't feel like a random act of violence. It was too deliberate, too precise. And he couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there had wanted him gone. Investigators came to the hospital to ask questions. They told him they'd found tracks near the old maintenance cabin, footprints leading away from the scene, and a few shell casings. No clear suspects yet. The attacker had disappeared. But there was one clue: a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch near the path. It wasn't from Miller's uniform. Whoever it belonged to had fled in a hurry. And strangely, some of the investigators said they had followed another trail, pawprints deep in the dirt leading them in circles, almost as if the dog had deliberately confused whoever was out there. Days turned into weeks. Miller was allowed to go home, though still weak and bandaged. But then something unexpected happened. A week after Miller returned home, a call came from his unit. They had caught a break. Miller hesitated. He was still weak, still healing, but something in the dog's eyes told him it wasn't random. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. But the dog didn't stop out there. Ahead, a faint flicker of movement. Someone was there. The figure was crouched near the abandoned maintenance cabin, rummaging through something. One of his own. A former officer who had been discharged months ago for misconduct. Before the man could run, the dog emerged from behind the cabin, cutting off his escape path with a sharp, commanding bark. The man tried to talk his way out of it, stammering excuses. But the dog didn't move, back upright minutes later. Cuffing the man and taking him into custody, the dog simply looked at him, calm and steady. That night, as Miller sat in his living room, the weight of everything finally settling, he looked at the dog lying peacefully on the floor and felt something deeper than gratitude. And though the case was closed, Miller knew the miracle wasn't just that the dog had saved him once. But there was still one more miracle waiting, something the dog would do that no one could have predicted. Weeks passed after the arrest, and the air on Sergeant Miller finally began to feel lighter. The investigation was closed, the betrayal explained. And for the first time in months he could sleep without waking in a cold sweat. But even as life settled back into something resembling normal, the dog never wavered in its watchfulness. It followed him everywhere: into town when he went for groceries, across the yard when he worked on small repairs around the house. Sergeant Miller, lying motionless, grimacing in pain, trying to wave weakly. "Down here," he called. When the rescue team finally made it down, they found Miller pale and weak, but still conscious, and the dog, still there, calm, watchful, and wavering. As they carefully lifted him onto the stretcher, the dog followed every step, its gaze locked on him, refusing to let anyone take him away without following. People from town began visiting the hospital, bringing flowers, cards, even small treats for the dog. Every time he woke, the dog was there. Every time he struggled to take a step during physical therapy, the dog walked slowly beside him, matching his pace, encouraging him silently. And in those moments, something changed in Miller. He realized that his life had shifted from being just about duty, about the badge, about the job. It had become about gratitude, about the quiet and spoken loyalty of an animal that had risked everything for him, not once, but twice. News reporters tried to cover the story, but Miller refused any interviews. Nurses would stop outside the room just to watch, their eyes misting over as they saw the dog gently nudge his hand whenever he looked tired. Children visiting other patients would peek in, their faces lighting up when they saw the dog lying calmly like a guardian angel. And Miller began to notice it too, how people softened in the dog's presence, how they smiled, how they were reminded that goodness still existed in the simplest, purest forms. To him, this wasn't a story about publicity. It was about something far more personal. The paramedics allowed it to ride along in the back of the vehicle, sitting quietly but alert, as if guarding him on the way to safety. The couple gasped. But before they could even think of what to do, the dog leapt back down the path to Miller, reaching his side within seconds. It lay beside him, pressing its body gently against his, its calm presence soothing him, keeping him from slipping into shock. One of the neighbors ran back to the house to call emergency services, while the other stayed at the top of the ravine, speaking to Miller to keep him awake. But the dog never moved. It stayed by his side the entire time, resting its head on his chest so he could feel its steady heartbeat, a grounding rhythm reminding him he wasn't alone. And even to the porch where they would both sit quietly at sunset, looking out at the horizon, Miller often wondered what went on in the dog's mind during those silent moments. They told him again what they told him after the shooting. He was lucky. But Miller shook his head weakly, looking at the dog lying at his bedside. "Not lucky," he whispered. "Protected." There was a wisdom in those eyes, a quiet knowing that seemed to stretch beyond the simple bond of man and animal. But life has a way of testing even the strongest connections, and one evening, just as the sky turned gold with the last light of day, another trial came unannounced. Miller had been visiting a neighboring property to help an elderly couple repair a broken fence. The property was large, bordering a steep ravine. The ground was damp from earlier rain, the edges soft and unstable. As Miller worked near the edge, he didn't notice the slight give in the soil until it was too late. The earth crumbled beneath him, sending him tumbling down into the ravine below. The fall wasn't far, but it was brutal. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs, pain radiating through his ribs and leg. He tried to move, but a sharp, searing pain told him immediately his leg was fractured, and he was trapped. He called out, but the nearest neighbor was too far to hear. His phone had fallen somewhere out of reach. Panic set in. He was alone. But not for long. The dog, who had been resting near the fence, sensed the danger before the fall even finished. It rushed to the edge, looking down at Miller with frantic eyes, barking sharply, loud and commanding, echoing through the trees. Miller tried to stay calm, whispering, "I'm okay, boy. Just get help." And once again, the dog understood, without hesitation. It darted back toward the property, running full speed toward the house. Inside, the elderly couple heard the barking so urgent, so unrelenting that they rushed outside, confused. The dog circled them, then ran back toward the ravine, barking louder. Something in its behavior told them this wasn't just excitement or play. Something was wrong. They followed. When they reached the edge of the ravine, they saw him. It took nearly 40 minutes for help to arrive. By then, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over the ravine. At the hospital, doctors confirmed the injuries: a fractured leg, several bruised ribs, but nothing life-threatening. Word spread quickly. This was the second time in just a matter of months that the dog had saved his life, first in the forest, and now again. Over the following days, as he recovered once more, the bond between them deepened in a way few could understand. But the miracle wasn't just in the rescues. It was in what the dog awakened in everyone who saw them together. And just when Miller thought the dog couldn't surprise him anymore, it did something even more extraordinary. Something that would change not just his life, but the lives of others who needed hope. Because one day, after his final checkup, the dog would lead him somewhere he didn't expect, to someone who needed saving even more than he ever did. Weeks later, Sergeant Miller was finally cleared to return home for good. His leg healed enough for slow, careful walks, his strength slowly returning. And through it all, the dog remained a constant presence, never demanding, never leaving his side, simply existing as a quiet guardian. One crisp morning, Miller decided to take the dog to a nearby park, a place he hadn't visited since before everything happened. It was a peaceful spot, filled with families enjoying the fresh air, children laughing, and other dogs playing in the grass. The dog had somehow tracked it, leading the family straight to their lost pet. The boy ran forward, crying tears of joy as he hugged his furry friend tightly. The mother dropped to her knees, overwhelmed with relief, thanking Miller over and over. Even though he had done nothing, it became a symbol in the community, a living reminder of courage, kindness, and the miracles that happen when loyalty is stronger than fear. And every evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a warm glow over Miller's porch, the dog would lie quietly at his feet, both of them finally at peace, knowing they had saved not only each other but so many more along the way. He simply stood there, watching, realizing that it wasn't just him the dog was meant to save. The dog returned to his side, tail wagging softly, as if to say, "This is what I was made for." As they walked along the path, Miller noticed a small group gathered under a tree, a young woman sitting on a bench with her head in her hands, clearly upset, while an elderly man stood nearby trying to comfort her. First, it was neighbors sharing the story, then the local newspaper picking it up, and soon people from all over began visiting, wanting to meet the dog that had saved not only a sergeant's life twice but also reunited a sick child with his best friend. The crowd clapped and cheered, but what made the moment unforgettable wasn't the applause. It was the way people's faces softened as they watched the dog quietly lean into Miller's leg, looking up at him with the same calm, steady gaze it had the day it saved his life. Miller spoke briefly, his voice thick with emotion. "I used to think I was the one protecting this dog," he said, glancing down at his loyal partner. "But the truth is, it's been protecting me all along." The hospital invited Miller and the dog back to visit patients, and every time they walked through those doors, people lit up with smiles, hope flickering in their eyes. The dog would gently rest its head on the laps of children in wheelchairs, sit quietly beside veterans who rarely spoke, and somehow, without any words, make them feel understood. It was as if the dog carried a silent promise that even in life's darkest moments, there was light. There was loyalty. There was love. A little boy, no more than 6 years old, clutched a faded photograph of a golden retriever and kept glancing toward the woods beyond the park. Miller paused, unsure whether to approach. But the dog didn't hesitate. It stopped walking, turned its head toward the boy, and after a moment, gently pulled the leash from Miller's hand with a soft but insistent tug. Miller watched in quiet surprise as the dog walked slowly over to the boy, stopping just a few feet away and sitting down, its eyes soft and calm. The little boy looked up, startled, then reached out a tentative hand. The dog leaned forward gently, resting its nose against the boy's palm. The boy's mother lifted her head, her tear-streaked face reflecting exhaustion and worry. She explained in a shaky voice to Miller, who had now walked closer, that their dog had gone missing 2 days ago, running off into the nearby woods during a storm, and no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find him. It was the boy's best friend, his comfort through a difficult illness. And he hadn't stopped crying since. Miller crouched beside the boy and smiled softly. "You know, this dog has a way of helping people. Maybe it can help you too." The boy's eyes widened with a tiny glimmer of hope. Without a single command, the dog stood, turned toward the forest bordering the park, and began to walk slowly along the trail. Miller, confused but trusting, followed with the family. The dog sniffed the air, pausing occasionally, its ears twitching as it moved deeper into the woods. Minutes passed, the tension thick, until suddenly the dog stopped. It let out one sharp, confident bark, then trotted a few more steps and disappeared behind a cluster of trees. When they rounded the corner, the boy gasped so loudly it echoed. There, tangled in a small thicket, was the missing golden retriever, muddy, tired, but alive. Word of that moment spread throughout the community. Months later, during a small ceremony held at the station, Miller stood with the dog by his side as the chief presented a medal of honor not just to the sergeant, but to the dog. From that day on, the dog wasn't just known as a canine partner.